Welcome to Scrum Masters of the Universe. So today's speakers we have here with us today, Tom. Tom is a speaker, author, and a coach. His software process and measurement podcast and blog has over 1 million views. If you like to know how to improve cycle time, your productivity, quality, morale, and customer satisfaction, Tom is your guy. Please do reach out to him. And Jeremy here is a coach, speaker, and an author. He started out as a technical writer on a Scrum team and found his calling to be a Scrum Master and an Agile coach, and then served as a Scrum Master, Agile coach, and a RTE and a mentor. So thank you, Tom and Jeremy, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today for the Scrum Masters of the Universe members. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Super. We're really glad to be here today. I am going to share some PowerPoint slides because what is a presentation without PowerPoint? By the way, I will up front make this announcement. Jeremy and I worked together before we didn't work together and then later wrote the book. So on Jeremy's bio, he keeps forgetting to put on there. You should put Jeremy is the cool guy. So at least of this duet. So today we'd like to talk to you about the 9 core principles of work intake for Scrum Masters and Coach, at least from that point of view. We can look at this from multiple different points of view, but today this is the Scrum Masters of the Universe. We'll go down that path.
Definitely. We're tailoring it for this audience. And I mean, I am a child of the 1980s, so I could not resist putting a couple Masters of the Universe like pictures in this presentation. So this is the first of a couple. I don't know how to really tie this in. I mean, if you think about the Masters of the Universe plot, you've got this, normal sort of cowardly, princely figure who becomes this really muscular guy with the help of a sword and magic, and they're doing, battle against evil. And I'm sure we could probably draw that correlation to how work gets done and how work comes into teams and organizations, right, Tom?
I'm sure we could, but then again, we could also go down to my basement and read the original comic books.
Ooh. So let's get a definition of work intake out of the way first before we dig a little bit deeper into the Scrum Master role in all of this. So really, we were struggling to find a definition of this. So we sort of went out into the field and tried to talk to our peers and tried to figure out what we might use as a definition for this whole work intake topic. It's really ultimately the way an organization decides what to do, how to spend its resources. So that's like money, but also how to deploy people, whether you're talking about individual Scrum teams or sets of teams across maybe an Agile release train or some other convention. And that whole intake phrase, I'll probably make this funnel motion with my hands at least once or twice today as we're talking. But when I hear that word intake, I think of that funnel metaphor that you've probably either seen online when this particular topic is discussed, or maybe you can visualize how work comes into teams, but it's really the amount of stuff that comes into a team or organization.
You have always been just the nice guy, right? So when we originally started wrestling with this topic, the phrase wasn't work intake, it was work entry. And many of us have read, Alyssa Atkins' book on coaching, right? And about violent words, work entry is a violent word. And in many instances, when you look at organizations, you look at teams, large, teams of teams, it isn't work intake. It isn't this nice, classy, okay, we'll bring it in when we're ready, which is probably gold standard-y kind of stuff. It's, hey, Jeremy, I need you to get these 50,000 things done next week. And I don't care what you have on your plate now, kind of thing. That's work entry. So, the definition holds either way. It's how that happens, right?
And that entry thing was very much driven by, Tom, I think what you and I had seen, not only in the place that we worked together, locking arms and working together, doing some coaching at that class establishment, but also what you've seen at other places, right?
Absolutely. getting work intake wrong isn't just, even though it's not a sexy topic. And when we were out pitching our book, it wasn't, people weren't going, oh, this is the book I've always wanted to read. It isn't the sexy topic. But when they got to talk about whether it's home, working with their kids, working in the publishing industry, when they were talking about what was going on, this was what was going on. This is not an esoteric topic. You get this wrong and work gets disrupted. Things that you were supposed to get done ends up not getting done. We probably all have watched Nyberg's video on YouTube with the little heads that he's making, right? And when you get interrupted, it's like, okay, I started it, and you went and jumped to something else. Bad things happen. Everything else ends up being late, and trust goes away. Is the trust a big thing, Jeremy?
I think it's maybe the biggest thing, Tom, because we want to work in organizations where we have trust, not only with each other, but with those higher level leaders that ultimately are usually the ones standing. I'll make the motion again. They're usually the ones standing kind of at the mouth of that funnel. They're usually
stepping
the ones
down hard, right?
Sure. Well, sometimes that's what it feels like, and that's the whole entry thing. They're either trying to cram more in the funnel, maybe with like the edge of their steel-toed boot, or some other kind of example. But really, we want to have trust with everybody we work with. And if we don't get this whole work intake thing under control, it causes a massive loss of trust that isn't necessarily obvious from the start, but it degrades and chips away at trust within an organization or team.
And that ends up causing all sorts of other behavioral problems. This isn't just a team level thing. So when we originally started wrestling with this topic, both of us work a lot with teams, so you have that perspective. But when you look at larger pieces of work, whether you call them programs or projects or release trains or products, regardless, this happens at every layer of the organization. And when one level fails, the next level tries to hold the line for some period of time and then fails. It becomes a cascade error down, and it just degrades, as Jeremy says, degrades trust all the way down. So we have 9 core principles that we talk about in terms of getting good work intake.
Yeah, so let's walk through them. Prioritization, this maybe is the most obvious one. It's something that I think we in our roles as Scrum Masters and coaches, man, if I had like $1 for every time I've used the word prioritization in a conversation with like a product owner or an executive or a product manager, I probably wouldn't need to come to work anymore. But that's like a common totem that we are out when we work with teams and programs to coach and preach. It's that idea that we need to prioritize the work on our backlogs.
Prioritization, is that the same as sequencing, by the way?
Not necessarily, Tom. We should talk about that later on.
Okay, we will. Control is the second, right? Work needs to follow a defined path. And I know we talk about giving people agency and making sure that we're doing the right thing, but it still needs to follow a defined path, both to enter the organization and to enter the team. Otherwise, we end up with chaos. And in the end, chaos isn't good. That's where Skeletor pops up. I couldn't help myself either.
That's a good one.
And wrestles things down.
Transparency. So this is another word that we Agile folks tend to use quite a bit, but really
maybe too
often. But the real role in the work intake equation is that you need to have transparent backlogs so that anybody can understand what's on the backlog at a given time. Whether you're talking about folks working at the team level or folks working at an enterprise level, that transparency is only going to be helpful in building some of the trust kind of stuff that we talked about earlier.
By the way, that's one of the reasons why cramming everything in a tool doesn't always work well in terms of transparency. It might make the process work, it might make things flow, but it hides it. And very frankly, asking an executive to go into Jira or any of the other tools and look up the backlog.
Career limiting, Tom.
I was exactly where I was going. Consistency. Consistency is the fourth one, right? And you have to have, maybe I'm ending up with all the process ones today, Jeremy, but consistency is important. People need to know how to behave. If they don't know how to behave, they're going to test the boundaries. My kids were a tad rambunctious when they were young. And very frankly, they were always testing boundaries. The only reason I think they're both still alive and in good, productive human beings is the fact that both my wife and I were consistent in terms of the message that we delivered. It's the same way with good work intake.
Let's talk about frequency. So it's got to happen at some level of frequency, whether you're talking about teams doing sprints, whether those sprints are weeks, months, whether you're talking about quarterly planning kinds of stuff, or even like an annual kind of planning thing. It's got to happen with some level of frequency, and it's got to happen regularly. Otherwise, it chips away at some of that transparency and consistency that we talked about earlier.
I'm a big fan of Scrum Bond, and we do some form of prioritization, work intake on the cadence, but we also do it on a daily basis. But again, we understand what the frequency is and consistency. To do that and do that well, you have to be prepared. It isn't just winging it. Winging it sounds good. It might be the way, I don't even know if it's the way to do anything, but winging it is a bad idea.
Respect. So this one I think is somewhat coupled with trust, which we talked about earlier. But man, the folks, whether we're talking about team members or line managers or VPs, senior VPs, or executives, they have to respect the work intake process. This stuff breaks down if you have instances where people are going to people they know and asking for favors, whether those favors are like stories and sprints or features and releases. All of this work intake stuff and having a process around it hinges upon people respecting that this is how the process works and respecting the outcomes you're trying to derive from this particular.
I'm laughing because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that more than once, Jeremy, when we were working in the same company, you had a CTO come up to you and sit near you and tell you what to do. That was not respecting the work intake process.
I did. I saw it happen not only with myself, but I saw it happen with other engineers to the point that it was sort of a running joke that if the CTO was in the office, there would be, word around the office that he was there, and folks would magically find somewhere else to sit for that day or find a meeting to be involved in so that they couldn't be akin to a drive-by from the CTO.
I happen to know the people who own the microbrewery down the street, and they did point out that that's why it was called Building 4. So there are consequences. There are consequences to violating work intake. It isn't a free pass. And I know this may sound draconian, but very frankly, when somebody jumps the queue, whether you're trying to get on a train in New York City or something, there are consequences to that behavior. That consequence, if it isn't addressed, can end up, it will end up being consequences to the rest of the team, not necessarily. So there needs to be some mechanism to capture that and make sure that it isn't injuring the team or the program at whole.
And the last one, principle number 9. So ownership. This is a nice segue to the upcoming slides that we have coming up. But part of having a process, agreeing on a process, respecting a process, and having consequences is like some ownership. So somebody's got to be responsible, but also accountable for this thing to happen. Right, Tom?
If someone isn't accountable, isn't responsible, then no one is. And when that happens, it's only good until somebody wants to or feels like there's value in abrogating the process. Before we go to the next slide, are there questions? I mean, we're having fun. it'd be good to know if there are questions out there that we can answer before we go on.
Yes, there are a couple of questions that I
Okay, we
see.
don't really want to answer them. We just no. Okay,
You built them up, Tom, and then
rip it away. It's like a Band-Aid.
Okay, so Lauren is asking, what would be a consequence for going outside the work intake?
Well, Jeremy, you want to take a poke at that first?
Sure.
Before I go all draconian?
Well, I think an obvious consequence is you don't get the work done. If you're an executive or somebody else who's asking for work to be expedited, and you don't have a great reason, you're going outside the work intake process. I think you just don't get that work done. I think that's the easy answer. I think you go in the backlog and get prioritized along with everybody else.
So a second answer, and I agree with Jeremy. That is probably the gold standardy kind of answer. But in the case where the answer is, well, you're just going to have to do something about the thing that's being pushed in. The person who's pushing it in really needs to go to whomever has to be displaced to make that happen and tell them that this happened.
Yep.
And interestingly enough, I mean, that has worked, right? You have to go tell the person that really was counting on this feature being delivered in the next release that they're not going to get it because your stuff is more important. You need to go tell them that. And lo and behold, having done that a few times, the behavior stops because nobody wants to be that big. So those are variants of kinds of consequences. The reality is, even if you don't enforce consequences on the person who does it, there are consequences on everyone else. Either they have to work longer, the level of quality goes down, technical debt goes up, or other stuff that's been promised doesn't happen and trust goes away. So go back to them and say no if you can, and say what has to be and what has to go, as a secondary.
So a follow-up to that was trade-off work. Like there's a question mark. I think that when you were talking about it, they had this question.
Again, I live a little bit more in the Kanban world, where there is a little bit higher ability to do trade-offs. So I think trade-offs are a mechanism, but again, look at those core principles. Are you really following some form of prioritization? Are you doing a transparency? Is this just being forced in without any preparation? So it's going to be a spin cycle. Trade-offs are okay, but make sure you're hitting the 9 core principles along the way.
Yeah, and I think I'll say one more thing before we get to the next question. I think another way to come at the trade-off conversation is around that frequency principle. So how often is work coming in? How often is the team or program given the ability to rejigger their priority list? So in Tom's Scrumban world, that probably happens daily, maybe weekly. In a more traditional kind of Scrum world, you're having that conversation at sprint planning boundaries. In a scaled agile world, maybe you're having that conversation at the sprint boundary as well as the PI boundary. So I think part of the idea there with the trade-offs is to understand what's an acceptable time duration to wait to have those trade-off conversations.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah,
so there's another question which says, would good work intake be something you would put into the Confluence working agreement?
I think that's a fantastic segue to our next question. Really, maybe we could go to the next slide and talk about that a little bit. We could go through the slide and then talk about the working agreement thing. So let's do that.
All right. So what we wanted to share is a couple of a gold standard and perhaps something to avoid at all costs kind of discussion, right? So Scrum is goldish standard kind of approach, right? The team at a team level work funnels through a single person. That's the product owner. They evaluate, they prep it, They go through, a process of prioritization. It's a good mechanism. The Scrum Master and the rest of the team defend their boundary kind of thing. Work gets pulled from the backlog. All of those are kinds of things that if we go to our 9 core principles, are high up on the 9 core principle list. There are some things that it misses, but at least at this level, this is a pretty good standard for work intake.
Yeah, it sure is. So let me tie this now into the question we got about Confluence and establishing working agreements. So I think the question there really is using Confluence as the tool to establish and document those working agreements. At least that's what I'm construing that comment as. And so I think if you're a team, let's say you're this team here of individuals, and you've decided that the way we're going to handle work intake is to funnel it through a single person. In the case of Scrum, that person is like our product owner, right? That is something you could undoubtedly document in your working agreements. You could also dig a little bit deeper as a Scrum Master, facilitator, coaching person and talk about what would happen if the CTO comes up to your desk on a random Thursday and says, hey, could you do this particular piece of work for me? And if the team is really firm on those working agreements, the conversation should be less about yes, sir, and accepting that work immediately, and about, hey, can we go pull in the product owner and we can have that conversation, the 3 of us together, to understand where this fits in our overall list of priorities. So can we drift into anti-patterny territory now, Tom, and maybe hit the next slide?
Okay. Why don't you describe this one? This one makes,
oh, sure.
This one makes me very anxious.
Well, it's okay. Good. Well, I'll try and reduce some of that anxiety by probably making you flash back to the situations in your life when you've seen this actually happen. Because unfortunately, this is a pretty common pattern that Tom and I have seen throughout both of our careers. And so we call this one front door pull and back door push. And so the idea there is, on the surface, a lot of it looks kind of like the gold standard. We think we have a really good process stood up for this. But if you notice that second bullet point and some of the graphics that are the arrows coming in on the team, what we've inevitably seen, whether it's with agile teams or teams outside the agile sphere, is that some work inevitably goes around whatever process exists. So if it's the gold standard that we talked about before, some of that work is going to go around the individual who's responsible for prioritizing that work for a team and responsible for work intake and make it to other team members. I think one of the more insidious ways that I've seen this in my career is the firm that Tom and I used to work with was founded as a startup in the 1990s. And so what had happened is a lot of the people that worked there were still around. And the firm had this habit of hiring in a lot of people who were related to one another, either by marriage or by genetics or by childbirth or divorce or marriage or whatever. And so one of the more insidious ways that I saw this happen in my last company is for work to get injected into teams based on like conversations at family dinners, conversations at happy hours, one person going up to somebody who was a blood relative in the office and talking to them and asking them to do something. This I've seen all this happen all the time.
It had, again, we saw it very graphically together, but very frankly, it happens everywhere. This is not this whole idea of work being funneled in critically. It really should happen that way, but it seeps in around the edges. Part of, I think, the role of the Scrum Master is to help, put a spotlight on that, help make all of the work be transparent, get it on the board, get it somewhere that people can recognize what's happened and as a team retrospect about it and make decisions. No one is going to end up telling the CTO to go pound salt. Albeit at a very large hospital organization. I do know a team lead that turned around and said, I'm not touching this until you give me a ticket for it. and that they're still there. I actually think they're a manager now, so it didn't overly destroy their career.
Not career limiting. So let's touch on Scrum, and then I think we have a short game to play, right? So we've talked about Scrum quite a bit. We've talked about how Scrum is goldish in its resemblance to our gold standard for work intake. So let's run through these principles quickly and how they correlate to Scrum. So we'll just tag team. So we talked about the product owner role for sure. Scrum fully addresses that whole concept of prioritization because that's a product owner responsibility.
And control, right? We use that product backlog. The Scrum team goes through planning, all of that, excellent. Dark check mark.
Yeah, the transparency thing, there's language in the Scrum guide about transparency of both product and sprint backlogs. So that's covered by Scrum as well.
The world goes down the toilet, though, when we start sticking it in places nobody can see it. Okay, well, I'll be a good person now. Consistency, invents are okay. It's a little bit more mute on how to deal with things when they aren't quite consistent, but pretty good.
Frequency, sprint planning, that's described very well in the Scrum guide, when it happens, how it happens, etc.
Preparation. I would really like that whole idea of backlog planning and working through that to be there. Sometimes gets talked about, but at least it's recognized, even though it's not formal.
Respect is an interesting one. So when the Scrum Guide talks about respect, it codifies it as one of those 5 values. But it's really, I think the language is focused more on people than on process necessarily. I think if you read into it, though, you probably could convey that it thinks about process when it talks about respect too. But really, Scrum doesn't totally have this one covered.
Consequences, I think it's just mute on that topic.
And the last thing, ownership. I mean, it's sort of in the name of the role, right? Product owner. Ownership is conveyed by that particular
and obviously people don't need to have these exact titles to play these roles. The roles are there in the mechanism. So again, we're suggesting that you reflect on what's in Scrum, what's in other methodologies, what's in other techniques, and leverage that, but look at it through that prism of those 9 core practices. Let's play a game.
Yeah.
War games.
Totally.
So off to the left here is a list of accountabilities, right? It is the ARPA method. It's a little different than other forms, like accountable is a person who's accountable to the business, reflects up strategic decisions. Responsible, 1 or 2 people who are responsible for the day-to-day execution. You can read the rest. Advisor, person who's consulted. Down the side is our 9 core principles that we've described. If you have a piece of paper in front of you, you can write this down very quickly. What we'd like to do is to take 2 or 3 minutes and take a look at that product owner role, the Scrum Master coach role, team members role, and go through and who is accountable? Who's accountable to the business? Who makes those strategic decisions? Who's participant? Recognize that really only one person can be accountable. You can have maybe a couple responsible. You can have lots of participants. And I don't know that you want to have a ton of advisors, but who knows? Take a few minutes and we'll use the chat to collect data when we're done. I shouldn't do that. That probably is a violation of some mechanism that says you can't put that on can't put that on YouTube.
The Jeopardy theme song.
Yeah, probably. I got sued by the RIAA once. It was unpleasant. Early in my podcasting career.
It's all that Napster stuff you used to do back in the 90s, Tom.
No, it was in the podcasting stuff. It was actually my theme song. Couple more seconds.
Yep.
All right. Jeremy, can you see the chat?
I can, sure.
Excellent. So
See if we have anything in here.
let's pick on that product owner role for a second. Which of those are the product owner accountable for? We'll give you our take on it when we're done here.
I see prioritization. That's good. Yeah,
Okay.
prioritization. That's a good connection. Thank you, Tricia.
All right. Any others?
Preparation. That's a good one. So Lauren dropped that one in the chat. I think that's related to some of the refinement activities you talked about earlier. I see product vision in there. Not necessarily one of the core principles, but I think that Daxonis, that ties definitely to some of those core principles. If we have a product vision, that helps us with things like prioritization, consistency. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. So good.
All right. How about Scrum Masters and coaches?
Okay. Scrum Masters and coaches: accountable, responsible, participant, or advisor. We're going to drop consequences in there. So consequences for violating work intake process. That's interesting. So
are
Tom,
they accountable, responsible, participant, or an advisor?
We have mentioned advisor, so I don't know if that was a relationship to the consequences and transparency comments, but I could see advisor being part of that. Yeah. Transparency, the Scrum Masters help him with that. Yep, I can see that. Cool. Thanks, folks, for that. Let's go on to the next slide, Tom, and talk through the 9 core principles in a product-centric organization.
All right. So what you have here is from multiple levels of the organization. Let's just focus at the team level for today. Our take is that in reality, the product owner is responsible for probably all of these, accountable for none.
What challenges can that create, Tom?
If you have a product manager, none. I think that actually is the right vision of the world. If you don't have a product manager, then the accountability piece and responsibility piece tends to, you tend to have a collision kind of thing going on.
Yeah, a collision.
How about on the Scrum Master side?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, if you look at that column on the far right, there's a lot of that advisor in there in terms of the coaching work that we do, the advising work that we do, whether we're talking about the Scrum framework specifically or about principles and values from the manifesto. A lot of advisory things, but I think the participant aspects are the ones that I'd like to focus on now. So preparation, we talked about how refinement is a thing that happens. I think, in my career, I think Scrum Masters and coaches provide a lot of value in terms of helping teams and product owners and organizations understand what good, well-refined backlogs look like, whether we're talking about team-level backlogs or higher-level backlogs. I think we can be really powerful in that domain. I also think that respect, I know we talked about how Scrum talks about respect and respect for people, but I think in our roles, we can help people respect the process because in many cases, the outcomes of a good work intake process are going to be beneficial for everybody that we work with. Last thing, transparency, and then I'll let you tee off on this, Tom. Transparency, we can definitely be helpful in terms of transparency. And no, I'm not thinking about, Tom, setting up a Jira board or making sure that we all have access to Jira Align, but I think that we can do a lot of work in our roles to make sure that this whole work intake thing is transparent, but also to advocate for it and to talk about it in a transparent way, not in some sort of like magical, opaque kind of context.
I like the idea of the coach and the Scrum Master on these 9 core principles, helping teams or large teams of teams make decisions, not making them for them. People who don't have input into how they work and are told how their work, like the old project managers did, wrote a book on that too. You know, you don't buy in. That's why engagement is so low. So let's, you know, what causes problems in work intake? Why don't we hit a couple of these?
Sure. So ultimately, when Tom and I were writing this book and thinking through what problems that we've seen, clearly not everything in our world of work and work intake are rainbows and or unicorns or some other fictional unicorn creature kind of thing. There were unicorns in Masters of the Universe, I think. There, yes. I know there was Battle Cat, the cat that turned into, you know, from Cringer to Battle Cat.
Cringer the Battle Cat. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but so we identified what we think are 8 primary causes of problems, and so we'll go through a couple of these. I think one of the biggest ones that we've seen that we spent a lot of time talking about, both to ourselves but to other groups, is that first one: differences in goals. So often the people that we work with, whether they're team members or people in sales or people in marketing or people in other roles across our enterprises, don't have the same goals. You know, maybe they're incentivized differently than we are. Maybe they're compensated differently than we are, or they just don't have goals at all. And so, one of the things that Tom and I really like to preach when it comes to this whole work intake thing is to align on a common set of goals across your enterprise, but also your team.
I mean, that alignment of goals, whether it's team or a team of teams, is so critically important, not only for work intake, but it's critically important to actually deliver it. So Ches Mihaly, if you've read the book Flow, talks about one of the preconditions for even attempting to get into a flow state is to have a clear vision, a clear set of goals. It's again, that's hard, right? So because when people disambiguate and don't have the same goals, we go in all sorts of different directions. Not because we're bad people, but because we're all trying to do the right thing. My favorite on this list is number 8, is yes-itis. And it is as bad a virus as COVID was. So very frankly, saying yes to everything means that you're saying no to pretty much everything too, right? Because every time you say yes, you're saying no to something else. It's just the way opportunity costs work. And we're all, well, many of us want to be nice, kind, well reflected on kind of people. Team, you know, all good team players. So when we're asked to do something, it's yes, and how far do you want me to jump in many cases? The answer can't be that.
It's the perception that we must say yes to be considered team players. I think the place that Tom and I used to work did not have the phrase "you must say yes to everything" on the wall of the building, but it did have core values around employees being family, partnership, etc. So, I mean, you could look at them and read between the lines and understand that the way to get promoted, the way to be considered a team player, was to say yes to everything. And when you do that at the expense of other things. And so Tom and I saw time and time again where well-intended, good-natured people, whether they were team members or managers or executives, would continue to say yes to things. And the things that were deemed really important strategically for the enterprise would just not get done.
And there is, you know, if you're not doing the things that are strategic, sooner or later, there are, you know, you have to pay the kind of progress.
Or Masters of the Universe, folks. So we tried to sum this up a little bit. Because if you take anything away from this conversation, it's to really know that you and your roles have a critical part to play in this whole work intake equation, whether it's doing some of the activities with a Scrum team, perhaps, or some of the activities that we described a few slides ago with product managers, with product owners. There are many things that you can do to help your team and organization master work intake. The first one is going to be going to the Gemba, if you will. We've got to put our glasses on. We've got to open our ears up and understand what's really going on, because so often this work intake thing and how an organization has handled it in the past, the culture built up around it, is hidden. You have to go in and see how things are done. You have to understand flow of work, whether it's the team level or higher levels. And then you've got to diagnose what's actually happening. You've got to diagnose which of those 8 things that we just covered are kind of happening. And you've got to tie those dysfunctions to some of the potential solutions that you could use. So solutions could be increasing capacity somehow, getting better prioritization around the work being done. But through those suggestions of changes, then you've got to retrospect on how those things are actually doing. So this is very much a PDCA cycle. But man, some of it's really hard to figure out.
It's funny, I was having this conversation this morning, this sort of laying out this flow of taking a look at, and the comment came back, but Tom, I've looked and there really, I don't see anything. Sometimes you have to step back. You have to ask a peer to come and take a look, to help you go through the gambit. You have to have a set of questions that you can use to frame that up. Don't just assume that if you've been working with a team forever, that you'll be able to see the problem. Recognize that you also may be part of the problem. And that's always hard to see. And that's always hard to hear. Ask a friend. Call in somebody to take a look. Use a framework set of questions if you're all alone kind of thing.
Yeah, speaking of questions, I think we've had some activity in the chat. Do we want to tee up another round of questions?
Okay, so I missed this question in the beginning. This is from W. Fraser. I know I'm dating myself. Do you remember Synergy Bus as a solution approach back in the 2000s?
I don't. Tom, I know you've had lots of CMMI practices.
I don't remember that exact practice, no. So I'd love to hear more about it so that we can then ask the question.
Yeah, I'll make a note of it. It's something we probably need to look into.
Sure.
Thank you. And Andy is asking, where can we get the presentation for today's session?
How do you deal with that generally?
You can post it to us. You can give it to us. We can share it on the YouTube channel. Or Marco, how will we can handle this later. We can talk.
Okay. We'll find a way. We'll find a way, or just just either, text or email Jeremy or I, and we'll be happy to share it.
Yep.
Thank you.
We'll get it to folks.
Brilliant. And we have a couple more questions. Yogi is asking the question. Some of the projects I've worked with, they expect Scrum Master to be responsible. In the metrics here, Scrum Master is not responsible for anything. Probably got to do with the waterfall mindset organization.
Okay, so we're talking.
Can I finish the question? Sorry.
Yes, please.
It says, so it says the organization that expects Scrum Master to be responsible. So how do you give it back to the people who expect the Scrum Master to be responsible?
Interesting question. I'll go first if you don't mind, Tom. I think that my immediate thought is you probably need to come to some level of understanding and agreement about who's got what roles and responsibilities, because I think the Scrum Guide is pretty darn clear on some of this stuff, at least with the product owner role and the division between product owner and Scrum Master. Now, I have undoubtedly seen scenarios in my career where, for whatever reason, an organization decides to put the product owner responsibilities along with the Scrum Master responsibilities, and sometimes even the people manager responsibilities, and put that all within one person. Recognize that is not the ideal, not what we're going for. I think there's a lot of value between the division that we have between some of these responsibilities and participant roles and advisor roles, because it's the perspective thing that Tom was touching on earlier. I think if you house all of the responsibility for everything and work intake in one person, that one person is bound to fail because they will miss something. Whereas if we're working with team members and Scrum Masters or coaches to understand how we're doing and evaluate how we're doing, we will get much better and much richer in our roles, much more robust manifestation of our roles.
I also suggest that question sort of leads me to at least ask the question, are we conflating a project manager and a Scrum Master? We're taking those two roles And that happens in a lot of organizations, right? Where you cram them together and suddenly the product, the Scrum Master is a project manager. The project manager is supposed to be responsible for these things. That's the discussion that needs to happen. And again, it really, if possible, you need to tease those out, have that conversation about it being a different role, or just name it project manager and, unfortunately,
Move on.
Suck it up.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from Lauren. Can you explain what need outstrips supply mean?
Oh, yeah. So I believe there's two so in general, it's like we have more need than ability to supply that need. So think about like a giant backlog and not enough people to actually do that work. I think that's probably the most obvious thing that you can see. So I think as we describe it, Tom, there's two versions of this problem. There's the boiling frogs or lobster version, which is we don't actually know this is happening. So this is, again, another reason that we as coaches, we as Scrum Masters need to be keen to understand, hey, our backlog's growing to the point that we're never going to be able to satisfy them. Because the reality of the situation might be the teams are churning through work as fast as possible, but never making any traction towards their large backlogs. So that's where that whole boiling frogs and lobsters thing comes in, because if you have them in the cool, tepid water and then turn the heat on, that's very different than dumping them into a boiling pot of water. Correct, Tom?
Yes. A friend of mine, at least somebody I call a friend, Alan Kelly, suggests that you take your backlog and you nuke it periodically. Obviously that's hyperbole, but it makes a lot of sense. If you have too much stuff on the backlog, the natural human tendency is to attempt to take bigger and bigger and bigger bites, and suddenly you have a whole Five Guys hamburger stuffed in your mouth, and swallowing is going to be a problem. So it becomes a difficult. There is sort of a darker version of this needs outstrip supply, and that is when your manager knows it and is using that as a mechanism to say, hey, look, our backlog is growing. If we don't do something, if you guys don't work faster, harder, smarter, all of that kind of stuff, then our clients will start to look for somebody else to do this work.
It's fear, Tom. It's fear.
And Deming said we should be driving out fear.
We have the last 5 minutes, so there's only one more question left. And Katie asks, how can someone get a signed copy of the book?
Oh boy, signed copy of the book.
They could let Jeremy or I know, and we'll have that discussion with you.
Yeah, that works.
We can make it happen. We actually do have some. We got together at a brewery and ate, I think, 400 wings between the two of us.
It was a heck of it was a lot. It was a lot, but they were so good, Tom.
They were so good.
Let's bring this home with our call to action, shall we?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And that's all the questions. If you want to land this right, yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, let's do it.
More questions. We'd love some more. Yeah,
and Tom and I are you've seen our contact information. We're happy to have you reach out to us one-on-one on LinkedIn or whatever else. We enjoy talking about this topic. But two things for your group. So the first thing is the thing on the left. Again, buying a copy of our book would be incredibly awesome. This goes way deeper into the topics that we've talked about just on this call. But it's a pretty good treatise on a topic that we think doesn't not get enough treatment in some of the books that we love. So that's why we wrote the book. The thing on the right, so we have started to do cohorts. So again, these are like classes that people sign up for. We're using the maven.com platform. So if you hit that QR code on the right, you can sign up for our mailing list. We expect that we'll be doing another workshop at some point soon. We will get you on that list and offer you the opportunity to spend a lot of time with us working directly on challenges that you're facing, but also with a group of like-minded peers. Yeah, so the cohorts that we've actually done, I would actually suggest that we talk far less than we talked today on those calls, and it's more of
you interacting with peers and learning from them, because we all have a different take on this. We all use different languages. And because we do that, we can all learn nuances that, just wouldn't be available.
Yeah, it's definitely got a community vibe and feel, just like this does. So last thing from us is this whole summer camp idea. Yes, it was an opportunity for Tom and I to dress up in goofy shirts and try and be a little bit silly. But we've been spending time on LinkedIn Live like every week this summer, unpacking some of those 8 primary causes of work intake. And I don't think these times conflict with this meetup, which is awesome. That would be kind of awkward if it did, but I don't think it does. So if you're able to make another meetup and put another meetup kind of in your week, these are really great opportunities to hear us riff a little bit on these topics, but also to tell stories and just generally act goofy.
30 minutes or less,
Yep.
and we hit every one of them. So we've
Yep.
you can actually see the ones before and make a choice, because we do tell summer camp stories along the way.
This was fabulous. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, we have a LinkedIn channel that we can go ahead and promote this. So thank you so much, Tom and Jeremy, for being here with us today and sharing all this beautiful information. We do have the links there in the chat for you to be able to join the cohort if you'd like to, or purchase the book from Amazon.